Hey, y'all. So, like Aaron said, my name is y'all. Yeah. Believe it or not, I'm actually not a Texan. I'm from Colorado. And yeah, so I'm one of the DCE practicum students. So I am studying to be a church educator. I also have another degree that I'm getting in elementary education, so I can manage a classroom. I'm looking at you. So yeah, and also like Aaron said, today we're going to be going through the story of 1 Samuel 17, which is about David and Goliath. It's really exciting stuff. And another thing that you need to know about me, and this is actually going to be relevant later on, is that I have like really bad stage fright, which is kind of crazy, right? Because I'm up here and you're like, well, why would you have stage fright? You're standing right there. I promise that will become relevant later because there's a lot of fear with that. But again, when we get through the text. So I think we're going to start out in our Bibles, and I can read the passage. So if we want to open up to 1 Samuel 17, I can read for us. All right. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. I'm sorry if I'm butchering these. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered, and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you not come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the man who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done to the man who kills him." Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" And he turned away from him toward another, and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand as he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David, with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shurim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son the boy is." And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." So, thanks for bearing with me. This is a bit of a longer chapter, as you guys can tell. So kind of what we're going to do today so first off, hang on. There we go. So in today's study, I just wanted to make sure you guys had a little look at what we're going to be doing. So we're just going to be diving into this scripture. We're going to see who God is and what God is up to in this passage, and then we're kind of going to look at what this tells us about God's nature and man's nature. And we're going to see how this applies to us today. And we're going to get to that point eventually. Yes, again, long text, but such a good one of my favorites. And so I mentioned before that I'm also teacher ed, and as teacher ed, I'm really big on discussion and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to have you guys be doing some discussing today. So what we're going to do is we're kind of going to go through chunks of the verses and answer some questions with your tables, because you're all, for the most part, neatly seated in groups. If you're not sitting at a table with a group, I can come around and talk to you, or you can move, totally up to y'all. And then we'll kind of go through it together and just dig a little bit deeper into those passages before we move on to the next chunk. Does that sound okay to everyone? Awesome. All right. So the first, and these are some key questions to consider while we're looking through the passage. So what does this passage tell us about ourselves and God? And what are some key themes that are residual throughout the chapter? And we're just considering these questions as we go. I'm going to have some other ones on the slides. But in general, these are just some ones to be thinking through. So kind of key themes, and what is this passage telling us about ourselves and God? All right, so with that said, we're going to start going through verses 1 to 11, and I'm going to give you guys like 3 to 5 minutes to discuss these questions with your groups. So the first question is, what are some of the things that stood out to you as key details from verses 1 to 11? And then the next question is, what did you notice about the nature of man and or God in this section? And then the last question is, what questions did you have in general regarding this section? So again, you guys can just take quick 3 to 5 minutes, and then I'll bring you back and we can do some more sharing. All right? Cool.
One army lined up here and the other one lined up here until they decided to engage each other.
How's it going? Oh, let me go grab you one. Finding anything?
Yeah,
It's a good passage, right?
I'm always a group of one, it seems like.
Well, I can discuss with you for a second. What are some of the things that you noticed in like the first 11 verses or so?
Okay, man without God is afraid.
That's a great one.
That is a good one.
That's something we're actually going to talk about. You and I are on the same wavelength with that one.
Because, David is looking at it through God's eyes. But all the rest of the army, all the skilled warriors, they're thinking, I'm not going to be able to reach him with my sword because his sword's bigger than mine.
Right? And he's like a huge guy. Yeah, and David's like, no, I'm bold because I got God.
Yeah.
Isn't that so cool? I love that part of the story.
And in arm-to-arm combat, you're not going to win. But David's smarter than that. He's using artillery. He's using stones to throw.
Yeah, and he's more logistical because he knows he's not going to win with a sword, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's so cool.
I love the part about Saul's armor, though.
Me too. And he's like, yeah, that's not going to work for me.
God's got a sense of humor.
He really does. Because he doesn't pick the people that we would assume he would pick, right?
Uh-huh.
Like, not the oldest brother or the strongest brother. Not even Saul, who's like the big, strong king. No, he chooses little David. Oh, I love that.
Well, and also, we forget that way back here when Saul first became king, he's head and shoulders taller than anybody else. So he's the tallest person in the army.
Yeah, he
And
is.
he's scared.
Exactly. And then the little guy, it's the little guy with the sling and the stone. I love that part.
I love that part, too.
Oh, it's so good. I love this story. All right.
One of my favorites.
Mine too. And I just like how God uses the unassuming people. All right, y'all, we're going to take one more minute so you can wrap up your conversations really fast. All right, so let's come back together, slowly start wrapping those discussions a little more. So now I'm going to ask you guys, with your groups, did anybody have any interesting insights that you and your groups discussed? It can be about these questions, or it can just be other things about the verses that you noticed. Anything like that. Go ahead.
One of the things that came out of this table is the emphasis on both the size and the armor, the size of armor that Goliath was carrying, to put a real image, threat, picture of who's this guy, and then with the armor, we did one calculation, and his we scaled the javelin would have been about the same weight as a 3-pound sled. So, a heavy. But it was a heavy piece.
Yeah.
That, just for the javelin, and then the other armor and another bit. Just the physical presence and potential fear that it would put in a human being, another human.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's one of the things I noted too. And like we kind of talked about that. Like it's this big, like huge person, right? So he was saying like the armor and just how big Goliath was and how intimidating that could have been. And the javelin too, because you mentioned that it was like really heavy. Yeah. I saw another hand over here. Go ahead. Yeah. I don't know. It might say somewhere exactly, and if it did, I must have missed that. But he was young, right? We know that he was young, and he was the boy David, so. That's definitely a relevant piece. And he was the youngest, too, so he wasn't even at the battlefield, right? Which is another interesting thing to consider. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so she mentioned how Goliath must have been so intimidating, and it kind of connects with, she said at the 8 o'clock service, the message was about like a threatening and intimidating with like running into a bear and how intimidating that was, because Pastor Potts mentioned that he had a lot of encounters with bears, which I was like, wow, that's crazy. But that's intimidating to us. Like, can you imagine with like Goliath? Because this guy's like 9 feet tall. Actually, I have a picture of him. Well, not a real picture of him, but a diagram. So this is like, just to go off of that. Oh, if it loads. It might not load. That might be a problem. There's another one here, but anyhow, in the comparison that I had, it showed the way that Goliath would have looked next to an NBA player. He's like 9 feet tall. Like that's basically what this is saying. So like he was huge and intimidating, and that really is relevant. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So sometimes it like how she was mentioning, in case those who couldn't hear, she was saying that people like on one side they were afraid of him, and on another side they were trusting in him. And that actually hits on a key point that I also saw in this, like reading this chapter that we're going to talk about more later, because like they were trusting in man, and we all know it didn't get them very far trusting in Goliath, but David was trusting in God, right? And that's what got him far, and that's what we're called to do. All right, I'll take one more over here, and then we can move on. Yeah, so he just compared it to President Abe Lincoln, how he was a strong and committed man, and then, like, God was with him. And, like, that's how we see David in this passage, too, right? Like, he was strong and committed because of the Spirit of the Lord within him. And one of the other things that I pulled out, I'll just share a few things that I noticed in these verses from the commentary I was reading. So in the commentary I was reading, it said that it was kind of a common battle practice for them to select a champion. And it makes sense that the Philistines would have selected Goliath, right? Because we talked about it. He's like this huge buff guy, and he's tall, and he's intimidating. And it makes sense, right? That they would pick somebody like that to be the forefront and to be their champion. And here's Israel, little scared Israel, and no one has stepped forward to be the champion because they're all afraid. And it's not that there's a lack of warriors, right? Because we know that Saul was a great warrior, and he was a tall guy. And where was Saul? He wasn't there. He was scared too. And they're just getting intimidated over and over again by this guy. And this guy looks like what we would perceive to be a great warrior in our human minds. And it's just kind of cool because we see later on, obviously, God doesn't pick the people to do like the things that are like the people we would think of, like the strong and the brave. Like he picks the people that are small little shepherd boys, like David, right? And so that's kind of a cool thing. Let me see. Anything else in here worth noting? I think that's okay. We can move on. So, all right, let's try one more time. Maybe my pictures will show this time. Nope. All right, that's okay. All right. So now we're going to move on to verses 12 to 23. So again, we'll just kind of do more discussion with groups and take 3 to 5 minutes and then kind of share back again. And I'll read out these questions really fast. So first question, again, what stood out to you most in this passage from verses 12 to 23? What do you notice about David's role in this section specifically? And I kind of want you guys to get thinking, if you were in his shoes, what do you think you might be doing or thinking, or kind of what might be rolling in your brain? And then if you had any questions regarding the passage, what those might be. And then this is kind of an interesting one, but bear with me. I kind of want to know where you guys might see yourself in this passage. Like, if you were in this position with all these different people, which role might you be in? Do you think you would be kind of like David, like, someone's got to stand up because this is God this man's dissing? Or like the Philistines, maybe, you know, you never know. Or maybe more like the Israelites who were just kind of like a little bit scared and intimidated. I know for me personally, I think that's where I would be. But yeah, so I just kind of want you guys to get your heads in that headspace and kind of see where might you be if you were in this situation. Yeah, so just 3 to 5 minutes to quickly discuss these things a little bit, and then we'll come back together. Anything standing out to you?
Pardon me?
Anything standing out to you?
I've read this so many times.
No, I totally get that.
Well, it's just that a few things that I forget, pop up, but you know, it's all in God's hands. We know that.
Yeah, and
so it kind of goes with the rest of the story.
and
to
God
put
takes
that-
it in his hands.
That's right. Yep.
And I think something interesting here is that, like, David is doing all this, and I think, like, we kind of forget, like, oh, it's because, like, the Spirit of the Lord was with him, because it mentions that in chapter 13,
Yep.
right? And I'm like,
Yep.
it's only by God that he does this, which is so cool.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
It's the way we live.
I mean, if we're living afraid, we're not living as we're called to, right?
That's right. Well, it's like Pastor Pot said at 8 o'clock this morning, right?
Yeah, that fit in
You can live
remarkably well with this.
Yeah. You can live in fright or you can charge ahead. They were talking this morning when I was going to get donuts and coming back. I was listening to Fox News on my radio.
Oh, yeah?
And they were talking about Kate having cancer.
Yeah.
And so, the closing part of that was Dr. Siegel, and I don't know if you pay attention to Fox
Yes.
News, so you may recognize that name. And then I can't remember the name of the woman who is the newscaster. They talked about the power of prayer. And
That's
how
so cool.
and how
On national
important
news?
that is. And
That's
that's kind of the way they close that segment of the news.
That's perfect. And that's really cool.
Yep, sure is.
That's a good way to do that. I'm amazed that they put that on the national news, too.
Oh, no, not with some, not with Fox, and some of them, they identify themselves with.
That's awesome.
That's a good one.
Amen. All right, y'all, we can take one more minute, start wrapping up those conversations, and then we'll kind of gather back in a minute here. Anything stand out for you?
Yeah, David was the youngest, and for the most part, he's alone. He's either with the sheep or he's walking to and from the battle.
Right, yeah.
Because it kind of implies he's done this several times, bringing supplies for his brothers. My question is, where were the other 4 brothers?
That's an interesting question. I didn't even see that in my commentaries that I looked at. Or do you mind if I bring that up when we're...
Go right ahead.
Okay, I will, because maybe someone here has the answer, and I would love to know.
Yeah,
Because it mentions, yeah, because there were 8, right? So yeah, where were the other ones?
yeah. Because if you imagine that the oldest brother is 30 and David's 15, you've got 15 years between the 2 of them.
Yeah, and there's all those other brothers in there. So where were
And
they?
some of them were over 20.
Yeah, for sure.
So why weren't they taking the cheese to battle?
Yeah, right. What's your name?
Bev.
Beth. Okay, I'm gonna mention that you had a question that was good because I'm like,
Yeah.
I want to know if someone else knows the answer to that.
Well, and I also have all older brothers too. So
You have all the what?
all older brothers.
Oh, so you're right in that mindset too.
So I'm thinking that way too.
Yeah, that's a good insight. All right, y'all, we're gonna gather back. Hopefully this time I don't run into this thing. Okay, so verses 12 to 23. So I'm just going to start out really fast with a question. So Beth and I were just discussing a question, and I'm curious if anyone has the answer, because I didn't actually see this in any of my commentaries. But she pointed out that we know that David is the youngest of 8, right? It was 8 brothers, and it mentions that some of them were at the battle, right? I think it was 4 of them were at the battle, or 3. Okay, so 3 at the battle. So where were the other ones? Does anybody know the answer to that? I don't know. I'm actually asking because I'm genuinely curious too. And I was like, hey, these people, they're super smart. They might have the answers because I certainly don't. Maybe not. I don't know. I was just an interesting question to speculate. And, maybe they weren't there because they were afraid too. I feel like that might be a good potential conclusion to draw. Obviously, we don't know for sure, but yeah. So anyhow, moving on. I just thought that was really interesting. So thanks for sharing, Beth. Did anyone else have anything relevant that you kind of discussed with your groups that you'd like to share with the rest of us? Oh.
It mentions here that David left the sheep with a keeper.
Yes.
Remember the expression, "I'm my brother's keeper"?
Yeah.
It had to be an older brother.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, he mentioned that it said that David left the sheep with the keeper, right? And so in that verse where it says, it talks about Cain and Abel, right? With his brother's keeper. Maybe it was an older brother, right? That had to have been keeping the sheep. That's a good thought. I hadn't thought of that. That's awesome. Go ahead.
One of the questions we came up with is why at that time did
That's an interesting one. He asked, why did Jesse send David to the front at that time? Yeah, at the time that he did. Because this was after Goliath had been out there intimidating them for a while, right? 40 days. Oh, go ahead. That checks out. I mean, God is so evident in this story. She mentioned that it was God, that God directed that at this specific time. Maybe that was God working through Jesse. I mean, yeah, that would make sense, right? Because God is so evident in the way that he's orchestrating everything in this story. So, yeah, and that's like one of those huge ways that like God is standing out in this. Go ahead.
We probably got a little bit ahead, but we also talked about the similarities between David and Joseph.
Oh, yeah.
That Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brother. Jesse sent David to check on his brother.
That's an interesting insight. He mentioned the similarities between David and Joseph, right? Because, like we'd kind of mentioned, Jesse sends his son to go check on his brothers, just as Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers.
Maybe Jesse's cook or whoever made special cookies.
I think that's got to be it, right? I mean, the special cookies, like, nothing hits the same as if it's made from home, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
David went back and forth from Saul to tend to his father's sheep and cattle. So he was back and forth.
Oh, okay.
This was going on for 40 days, so at some point he got
David
there and
was
Saul was
playing
going off.
the lyre to calm Saul's moods. And that happened years before when God told Saul he took the kingdom away from him. So David being back and forth with Saul was part of his ministry to Saul.
I like that insight, because he was ministering to Saul, right? Because him playing the lyre was the thing that was calming him. And then in addition, he was being an obedient son to his father, you know, going back and forth and taking food to his brothers. Go ahead.
And like the first couple verses, like describing what David was, like his family, it's kind of saying how he's the youngest, he's the servant. That's then when it's like, go take this loaves of cheese to your brothers, like you're the servant, go do it, because you're not fighting, you're too young to do it. And then when at the very end said that he heard, it's probably like, wait, why hasn't anyone like gone to fight him? Like he's like, because the army of God, they're like threatening, like scared, making like the army of God scared. Like you shouldn't be, because you have the power of God on your side. You can like use that to make sure like you defeat them. Like use it to not be as scared.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a good insight, too. She was mentioning, for those that couldn't hear, that she noticed how, oh shoot, now I just like totally, I was like wrapped up in what you were saying and trying to process the end part of that, but how he was like the servant because he was the youngest son. Like he might have taken on that role at times, being the youngest son, right? And then, you know, as he's doing this, he's like seeing this thing that's happening, and God is just like moving in his heart. And that's something we're going to get to a little bit. Go ahead, ladies. Or one, either one.
I think there could have been genuine concern on this father's part. He already has 3 sons in battle. I mean, my husband's from a large family, and you know, his three older brothers were already in Korea. So he to hear number 4 is going, and the father is greatly relieved that he was sending him someplace else besides Korea. And I think, you know, the father could have been genuinely concerned, and he's going to lose. So check on them, you know, bring some food and see how things are going. And so he would, maybe the father would be more relieved, you know, that they're okay.
That makes a lot of sense. She mentioned that, you know, maybe Jesse was sending David back and forth to kind of check in on his sons, make sure they were all well, which I think that would make a lot of sense, right? Because, you know, I'm not a parent, but my parents, I know they still worry about me and check on me even though I'm living in a different state. And, like, that would totally make a lot of sense. Go ahead.
Well, I think of the story when I was growing up. The story of David and Goliath was always about the size, Goliath's size, and then David got his strength from the Lord, and with his slingshot and his stone and killed him. And which it says Goliath came forward morning and evening for 40 days. And it said it's a period of time to complete the spiritual challenge, which you see many times through the Bible with Noah and Jesus in the wilderness and the 40 days of lamp.
Yeah.
Used for repentance and just focusing on the Lord.
So she picked up on something really interesting with the number 40 because it was 40 days. And you're right when you say that. The number 40 is something that's really significant throughout Scripture. And she mentioned how we see Jesus 40 days in the wilderness and 40 years for the Israelites wandering in the wilderness because of their sin and all those kinds of things. And it was generally a period for repentance. So that was super interesting. All right. So just to keep us moving along, a couple of other things that I wanted to point out in these verses. It was just really, I thought it was really interesting how, like, the armies were just, like, totally at a standstill. Like, all these, like, I know I kind of already hit on that, but I think it's interesting. Like, all these big, tough guys are there. And then there's just scrappy little David. He's just walking along, and, like, he's the one that's, like, coming in and seeing this and seeing what's happening. And I think it's also important to note that, like, in the eyes of the world, like, this was, like, what David ended up doing was not his role, right? Like, we talked a little bit about how he was the youngest son and how he was being an obedient son and listening to his father, his earthly father, and taking food back and forth and just serving his older brothers. But then we kind of see this shift where he also starts to listen to his heavenly father, right? And God uses him to do what he's going to do. And something else that's interesting I noticed is that if we flip back to 1 Samuel 13, I think I'll read it to you. It's verses... oh goodness, I think it's verses 19 to 22. I have it written down, but it's lost in my notes. It says, oh wait, no, that's not the right one. It was chapter 16, where we were last week. My apologies. But at the very end of chapter 16, it says, I guess it's not the very end either. My apologies. It talks in verses 12 through 14, I think, or 13. In verse 13 it says, "Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward." So I thought that was significant because we see that, like, David has the Spirit of the Lord with him. And something interesting is that, like, I think a lot of the times we see David as, like, this great, powerful warrior, and, like, he's one of the heroes of the faith. And to an extent he is, right? But it's also important to center ourselves on the reminder that he was doing this because of the Spirit of God within him. That's what was prompting him to this action. And that's what was prompting him to do this crazy thing. Because if you look at it in hindsight, like, my little sister, I'll give this example. She's 3 years old. And I don't see her going and facing some, like, high schooler on the playground that's way taller than her or something, right? Like, that just doesn't make sense in my mind. And maybe that's not exactly the best analogy to compare David and Goliath, but that wasn't really David's role, but because of the Spirit of the Lord empowering him, that's what he was doing. And I just thought that was really interesting. Any other thoughts on that before we move on to the next few verses? Oh, go ahead.
We were just talking about how, in the end, was farther down in the chapter, how Saul acted like he'd never met David, didn't know him. And he'd been there, you know, during his,
Crazy phase.
yeah, and then he acted like he never met him.
Yeah. That was interesting. He mentioned, for those that couldn't hear, that it was interesting because we see later on in the chapter, Saul sees David again, and he kind of acts like he doesn't know him, right? And even at the very end, when he's like, who's the guy that slayed Goliath? And, like, he doesn't really know. It's kind of interesting because, like, we know that from what you said, David was the one that was coming and playing the lyre for him to try to, like, chill him out and calm him down. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I don't know what, like, the reasoning for that might have been, other than, no, just, like, he's this big king and maybe it just fell under his radar or something like that. But that's an interesting thing to consider, too. All right, so let's move on to the next section. The next section is pretty hefty. I would like to say this is, like, maybe a little more of the meat of the story. So here we go. All right, so we're going to be reading through verses 24 to 37. We can just kind of review and skim through those and then discuss. And the questions we're kind of going to be looking at, there's a few more here. Just bear with me because it's a heftier chunk of scripture. But what do we notice about David speaking? So kind of like, what's he saying? What's he doing? What is the meaning behind his words? We're where do we see God in these verses? Because obviously we know God is at work in here, and especially in this part of the story where David is like, dude, someone's got to stand up for this, right? And then the other thing I want us to do is kind of read closely through the sections about Eliab and Saul doubting David, because as we read before, we see that his older brother Eliab is kind of like, hey, you need to chill, dude. And also Saul is like, I don't know if you're the one cut out for this. So there's kind of some doubt there. So I would like you guys to just look kind of closely into that, and then maybe like start to speculate, why do you think that they react in the way they do? And then in the same vein, what about David's response to them might kind of challenge you or surprise you, especially as he's discussing things with Saul and Eliab. So we'll just take another 3 to 5 minutes or so and discuss that, and then we'll come all back together.
In today's world, boys are considered from the Jewish religion. I'm not sure about that. But if they were, David's 14.
Okay.
And secondly, other thing, let me think about this a minute. I think I've read some books where they think that Saul actually, the king, was actually having memory problems.
Oh.
And maybe either suffered from like Alzheimer's, and that's why I didn't recognize David.
And even then again, a few minutes later, like not a few minutes, but
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
that would make so much sense. Do
Yeah.
you mind if I share that with
No,
everyone?
I don't care.
What's your name?
Jerry.
Jerry. Okay. I'll mention that Jerry had a good insight, because that's
Well, what's in my insight? That's something I just read, and I just thought, because I didn't know though if they still did that, if they did that back then, like they do now, where a 12-year-old man.
so then that would have meant like David's a man, but he's a very young man.
He's a very young man, but he still has the responsibilities of being a man. So, but I don't know.
Oh no, those are good insights. I'll share those because that might kind of help us get more perspective on the story.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that, especially like the second one. That would make so much more sense.
Yeah. I didn't ever pick up on it either until I read this one book, and they were saying, well, we think that maybe Saul was starting. Well, they said Alzheimer's, but you can have other things that cause memory loss. So, oh shoot, you're gonna kill me.
Oh, do you want me to grab some paper towels? Here. Do you think I could grab paper towels from back here? Sure. Straight in the faucet. Oh, sweet. Thank you. Go. I think we'll need a couple more. Sorry, I wasn't very fast with that. Let me go grab you a couple more too.
Yeah, exactly.
You're welcome. All right, y'all, we'll take one more minute or so we can start kind of wrapping up some of those conversations.
Okay, got another question for you. How many baby boys do you know of named Eliab?
None.
None.
I know that the prefix L is like
It's one of the names for God, so it's got to be a biblical name. But we know dozens named David.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and I think because like here, like God doesn't use the oldest son, the Eliab, he uses David, the youngest. And like we want to like almost
Yeah.
remember that, which is interesting too.
Yeah. Quite often God will choose the younger son. I was thinking about that just recently because of all the cancer they have in the royal family.
Yeah.
And now that the Prince of Wales has become king, but he may not be king for very long.
Because he's got cancer, right?
Yeah, it passes on to a different son. And that has happened throughout history. Quite often, the Prince of Wales dies in battle or something happens and he's not king. And it's the Duke of York who
Yeah.
becomes the king.
And they use the
second son.
unexpected younger one.
The younger son becomes the king.
That's an interesting thought too.
Yeah.
That God uses the unexpected.
He
Truly.
does the unexpected. Queen Elizabeth's father was the Duke of York.
Oh, really?
Yes, the second-born son.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Well, most people forget that because of World War II. But
That makes sense.
there was a problem with the Prince of Wales marrying the rich heiress from New York City, whatever. And she had connections with Hitler
Oh.
in the cabinet. And the last thing in the world England wanted was
To
for
have a
Uni-
connection with that.
have the United States join Germany in World War II. That would have wiped out Britain for sure.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a conflict there too. But anyway, interesting story.
Yeah, that's wild. I had no idea.
Yeah.
All right, y'all, we can kind of gather back now and just kind of share some of those insights. So when you guys were discussing with your groups this time around, did anyone have any kind of interesting thoughts about the questions or just other things you were reflecting about? Go ahead, back there. Yeah, I like that insight. He was a shepherd, but as a shepherd, he was also a protector of those sheep, right? And then it's kind of interesting because now he's becoming Israel's protector. And that whole connection is really interesting because we see, so if we fast way forward into the New Testament, right, we see Jesus, and he's called the Son of David. And there's some really interesting connections there because obviously, like, we see David here coming to redeem them, but we still know David's imperfect, right? And, like, that is something that definitely comes up later on in his story. But whereas David was imperfect, that's where we have Christ coming in to redeem his lost sheep and to redeem his people from our sin. Like, here David is saving these people, God's chosen ones, from earthly oppression, right? But Jesus saves us all from eternal oppression of sin. And that's an interesting thing to point out, too, with the whole shepherd thing. Yeah.
We were debating who we would send out, we chose Calvin.
Oh, he seems like the perfect David, I think. Right over there. Go ahead, over here.
I read elsewhere that the people that used slingshots were deadly. I mean, those were not. They really weren't unarmed. I mean, it sounds, like what is, kids playing with slingshots, but they were deadly. Deadly accurate. And the only thing that wasn't covered with armor would be his face. And I'm sure David had been using that slingshot, many times before.
That was interesting what she shared about the slingshot. So she said the slingshots she read somewhere were actually considered to be quite deadly. And probably he'd used it before and had some experience. And it's interesting too, because we kind of see that theme come up again of God uses the unassuming, right? Because first God's choosing the youngest son, and the son that's not a soldier, like his brothers or like the other soldiers of the Israelites. We also see him using a sling and a stone, which, while it is deadly, it's not the weapon we would think of to fight Goliath, because he's this huge guy, right? And something else that was interesting is if you go back a few chapters, it mentions that the Israelites really didn't have that many weapons with them. So like, no wonder they were scared. And then here comes David, and he's just got a sling and a stone, which might seem unassuming, but then it ends up being deadly. Go ahead.
Well, and he was trusted to take care of the sheep, so killing a lion or bear was a normal day for him. And this is how he looked with Goliath. Another threat.
Yeah, and he just looked at him, Goliath, as like just another threat that was coming that he needed to defend from.
The children of Israel, when they come against something, then they lose their confidence, forgetting that God has delivered them many times before. I mean, through people like Gideon, who was the least, and that, kind of those stories, that he had already delivered them before when they believed and trusted, and they come against another one, he's not with us this time, or they lack that trust.
Go ahead.
I noticed that he had 5 stones. He knew he might have to reload.
That's true. He did have 5 stones. He was like, this might not work, but we're going to try again. He was ready.
Goliath had 4 brothers.
Goliath had 4 brothers?
That was,
Oh.
research that.
Oh. And so 5, 1 for each brother, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Because I'm guessing they're probably, I guess we could assume they might have been.
Goliath up there, you don't know how many of the brothers were behind the line waiting.
That makes sense. And they were, probably intimidating looking too. We could assume. Go ahead, back here.
One of the points we talked about a little bit is in the earlier verses there, where David is confronting the men. This guy's a heathen. He's attacking you, our God's people. Don't you trust God? Are you not trusting God to take care of you? And we felt that was really coming out in, starting with 24 through about, a big piece of that reading, part of the reading.
Yeah, that's,
David just, in essence, yelling at him, where's your faith?
I think that's kind of interesting too. Like, can you just imagine this kid? He's like probably like 12 to 14-ish, and somewhere in that realm maybe. He's just standing there chewing out all these warriors, like, about, hey, you guys need to trust in God. And then he goes and trusts in God enough to like kill this giant Philistine. Like, that's a powerful image about trusting in God and like leaning on him and leaning on what he can do and not what we can do. Did I see your hand earlier?
The other soldiers' focus was on what they would get, the monetary gain, the wife of the daughter of Saul, and David's focus was on God. And then his brother accuses him of focusing on those things that he was actually the one that was focusing on, and how that carries over to today too.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight as well. Like how, for those that couldn't hear, she was mentioning how like everyone else is kind of focusing on the monetary gain, but David's just focused on God. Like they're all like, oh, well, these are the things that are going to happen for the one that kills the Philistine. And David's out here like, excuse me, what about how he's like defaming God and God's people? Someone needs to stand up for that, right? And so I think that's kind of interesting. So for the sake of time, because I think we just have a few more minutes here, let me see if there was anything in there that, you guys hit on a lot of like awesome things too. You are such a great interactive group also. Just, that's awesome. Let's see. Now I've got myself all lost. So sorry. Well, so I think that's interesting, just how the story progresses. And then another verse I want to highlight, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit here because we're running out of time, but it's verse 45. Do you mind if I just read that again? Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. I think that's interesting, and that really connects to what you were saying, because like here we obviously see like David is like, I don't look assuming, and like this is after like Goliath has just like looked him up and down, and it says that Goliath disdained him, right? Because he's just a small kid, and he's not like huge. And something actually that Jerry mentioned back there was that in the Jewish culture, like traditionally, Jewish boys are seen as men at the age of 12, and that's now. We're not sure what that looked like back then, but even so, we think David was young, right? So he was a young man, if at all a man, right? And Goliath's looking him down and disdaining him. And instead of David being like, oh, how dare this guy diss me, he's instead like, hey, you're dissing on my God, and like I'm gonna have something to say about that. Go ahead.
We had a devotion earlier this week that the wife and I go to, and we were talking about the importance of the head. You go back to Genesis 3, you will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head. And so the severing of the head goes all the way back to Genesis.
Yeah. So talking about the head and that connection with how in Genesis it talks about he will bruise your heel, but he will crush your head. That's kind of what happens to Goliath here, right? And we see that again with the connection, like how eventually that verse in Genesis kind of speaks ahead not only to this, but also to Christ, right? Christ crucified. And again, he's the one that redeems us, so that's awesome. Go ahead. Yeah, and you hit on a really big point there, which I'll kind of jump ahead to now because I wanted to make sure we looked a little bit at application. And again, we're really running short on time here, but she mentioned that like Goliath's looking at him and he's very unequipped to the eye, right? But because he's trusting in God, that's the key point. Like that's the thing that keeps him there. And so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because we didn't quite get through some of these. But this is also another verse that I thought connected well, but, also I'll just skip ahead. So to skip to right here, there's just a couple of themes that I thought I derived from this passage that, as we've been discussing, I think have also hit on. So we see that God uses the unexpected, right? He doesn't use the one that we would expect him to use. He sustains those who trust in him. We saw this with David. Not only did he protect David in those situations where he was defending the sheep, but then he protected David, and he brought him through when he was defending his sheep, God's sheep, the people of Israel. The other thing that I thought was worth noting was that God sometimes calls us to do uncomfortable things, and we're supposed to trust in him with this and move forward in peace and with peace. Like, we don't see David being afraid, even though he seems to be the unequipped one, right? And that's because he's trusting in God, and it's the Spirit in him that's moving him to do this and to have this trust. And so, just for a little application piece here, last slide, how does this all fit together for us today? Just to highlight a few of these bullets here, I think it's important that as we're going through and trying to apply this to ourselves today and kind of seeing David's boldness, I think it's important that we need to remember that the same Spirit that God gave to David is the Spirit that rests on us, right? The Holy Spirit. And with the Spirit in us, we are empowered and we can trust in God. And so going with that, I think it's important that as we go through the rest of this week, we can kind of be asking ourselves, how can we be bold to trust God this week? And what action can we take to trust God to be our shield, even in fear? Because there's a psalm where David himself calls the Lord his strength and his shield. And here we see that in this whole story that God has shielded David and provided for his people. And so he'll do the same for us. Any final thoughts before I let you guys go? I know I went a little bit over. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
I'd like to restate our First Amendment to the book people we do not know. It says, Congress shall make no laws establishing a religion, or shall not prohibit the free exercise thereof. But our own Supreme Court in 62 and 63 defied that amendment to remove
I think that's why it's so important to trust in God, right?
And number one is the Western world of the literacy. I can't remember which one.
That's okay, but it's important to remember that and to remember that we're called to trust in God and be bold in our faith. Thank you. Sorry.